The letter that changed everything. What happens when a woman carrying another man's love letter finds herself face to face with a lonely rancher who mistakes her for his mail-order bride? Sometimes the wrong destination leads to the right love. The dust kicked up by the stagecoach wheels settled slowly in the afternoon heat as Clara May stepped down onto the wooden platform of Willow Creek Station. Her fingers trembled slightly as she clutched the worn leather satchel against her chest, feeling the weight of the letter inside. A letter that wasn't meant for her. A letter that could change someone else's life forever. The small frontier town stretched before her like something from a faded photograph. Wooden buildings lined a single dirt road, their paint weathered by countless seasons of sun and snow. A few horses stood tied to hitching posts, swishing their tails lazily in the warm breeze. Clara May had expected California to be different somehow, more golden perhaps. But Willow Creek looked much like every other town she'd passed through on her long journey west. She adjusted her simple blue traveling dress and looked around uncertainly. The stagecoach driver was already unloading mailbags, and other passengers were being greeted by waiting family members. Clara May stood alone, holding tight to her precious cargo. 3 weeks ago, back in Kansas, her dying sister Margaret had pressed the letter into her hands, with tears streaming down her pale face. "Promise me," Margaret had whispered, her voice barely audible above the prairie wind rattling the windows. "Promise me you'll take this to Thomas Brennan in Willow Creek. Tell him I'm sorry I can't come." Clara May had promised, of course. What else could she do? Margaret had been planning to marry Thomas Brennan, a rancher she'd never met but had been corresponding with for months. It was a practical arrangement, the kind many women made when faced with few choices and fewer prospects. But Margaret's weak heart had finally given out just days before she was supposed to make the journey west. Now, Clara May stood in Margaret's place, carrying news that would surely break a stranger's heart. "Miss Patterson." The deep voice startled her from her thoughts. Clara May turned to see a tall man approaching, his hat in his hands and hope shining in his dark eyes. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 35, with sun-weathered skin and calloused hands that spoke of hard work. His brown hair was slightly mussed from his hat, and when he smiled, fine lines crinkled at the corners of his eyes. "I'm Thomas Brennan," he said, his voice warm with anticipation. "I've been waiting for you." Clara May's heart sank. This was the man Margaret was supposed to marry. This kind-faced stranger who looked at her with such gentle expectation. She opened her mouth to explain, to tell him about Margaret's death and deliver the letter that would end his dreams of companionship. But before she could speak, Thomas stepped closer and took her free hand in both of his. His touch was surprisingly gentle for such large, work-roughened hands. "You're even prettier than your photograph," he said softly. "The journey wasn't too hard on you, I hope." Clara May felt her cheeks warm. She glanced down at their joined hands, then back up at his earnest face. Something in his expression made her hesitate. It wasn't just hope she saw there, but loneliness too. A deep, aching loneliness that she recognized because it mirrored her own. Double quotes, she began, then stopped. "You must be tired," Thomas said, misreading her hesitation. "Come on, let's get you home. I mean, to the ranch. Your new home." He gently took her satchel and offered his arm. Clara May found herself walking beside him toward a sturdy wagon, her mind racing. She should tell him the truth right now. She should explain about Margaret, give him the letter, and take the next stage east. But as Thomas helped her up onto the wagon seat, she caught sight of something that made her pause. There, tucked behind the driver's seat, was a small bouquet of wildflowers, clearly picked fresh that morning. The simple gesture spoke of a man who had taken care to make his bride feel welcome. "I picked those for you," Thomas said quietly, following her gaze. His cheeks reddened slightly. "I know they're not much, but I thought, well, I wanted you to feel welcomed." The lump in Clara May's throat grew larger. This man had no idea that his bride was dead. He'd spent the morning picking flowers and probably planning how to make a good impression. How could she destroy that hope so quickly? "They're beautiful," she managed to say, and meant it. As the wagon rolled along the dusty road toward Thomas's ranch, he talked icily about the land, the cattle, his plans for the future. His voice was soothing, and Clara May found herself relaxing despite her inner turmoil. Thomas spoke of practical things mostly, but there was poetry in the way he described the sunset over the mountains, and the sound of the creek that ran behind his house. "It gets lonely out here," he admitted as they crested a small hill. That's why I'm so grateful you came." The ranch house came into view then, a simple but well-built structure surrounded by corrals and outbuildings. Smoke drifted from the chimney, and Clara May could see that someone had planted a small garden beside the porch. It looked like a home, not just a house. Thomas helped her down from the wagon with the same gentle care he'd shown at the station. As her feet touched the ground, Clara May made a decision that surprised even her. She would stay the night, at least. She would give him this one evening of happiness before she told him the truth about Margaret. But as they walked toward the house together, the letter burning like a secret in her satchel, Clara May realized something that shook her to her core. For the first time in her 26 years, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Standing beside this kind, lonely rancher, looking at this simple home with its cheerful garden and welcoming porch, she felt a sense of rightness that she'd never experienced before. Inside the house, Thomas had clearly made an effort. The wooden floors gleamed, and there were more wildflowers in a mason jar on the kitchen table. A pot of stew simmered on the stove, filling the air with savory aromas. "I'm not much of a cook," Thomas said sheepishly, "but I thought you might be hungry after your journey." Clara May set down her satchel and looked around the cozy kitchen. Through the window she could see the sun beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. This was Margaret's dream, she realized. This peaceful home, this caring man, this chance for happiness. But Margaret was gone, and Clara May was here. "Thomas," she said quietly, turning to face him. "I need to tell you something." He looked at her expectantly, his dark eyes patient and kind. Clara May took a deep breath. "I'm not who you think I am." Thomas's expression grew concerned, but not alarmed. "What do you mean?" "My name is Clara May Patterson. Margaret was my sister." She reached into her satchel and withdrew the letter with trembling hands. "She asked me to bring you this. She died 3 weeks ago." The color drained from Thomas's face as he took the letter. He opened it carefully and read it in silence, his shoulders sagging with each word. When he finished, he looked up at Clara May with eyes bright with unshed tears. "She wrote that she was sorry," he said hoarsely, "that she hoped I could find happiness somehow." Clara May nodded, her own tears threatening to spill over. "She talked about you often. She said you sounded like a good man, a man who deserved love and companionship." They stood in the quiet kitchen as the sun set completely outside, leaving them in the gentle glow of the oil lamps Thomas had lit earlier. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who understood loss and loneliness. Finally, Thomas spoke. "You came all this way just to bring me bad news." "I promised her I would," Clara May said simply. Thomas studied her face in the lamplight. "You could have just sent the letter. Why come yourself?" Clara May considered the question. "Because I think she knew I needed to make this journey as much as you needed to hear the truth from someone who cared about her." "And now?" Thomas asked quietly. Clara May looked around the warm kitchen, thought about the flowers he'd picked, the care he'd taken to make her feel welcome even when he thought she was someone else. She thought about the loneliness in his eyes that matched her own, and the way she'd felt walking beside him toward this house that felt like home. "Now," she said, meeting his gaze steadily, "I think Margaret knew exactly what she was doing when she sent me here." Thomas stepped closer, hope flickering in his expression. "Clara May Patterson," he said, testing her name on his tongue. Would you consider staying, not because you were supposed to marry me, but because you want to?" Clara May felt her heart flutter like a butterfly taking wing. "I don't know anything about being a rancher's wife," she admitted. "I don't know much about being anyone's husband," Thomas replied with a gentle smile. "Maybe we could learn together." Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Inside, two lonely hearts had found each other through loss and hope and the simple act of keeping a promise. Clara May reached out and took Thomas's hand, marveling at how right it felt. "I'd like that very much," she whispered. Sometimes, she thought, the most beautiful love stories begin with the end of another. Margaret had sent her west carrying news of death, but what she'd found instead was the beginning of life. Her life, their life, together.